everyone, my name is Emma Bielman and I'll be discussing the Civil Rights Movement and what it accomplished. First, some background on why the Civil Rights Movement was necessary. Before the Civil War of the 1860s, there were about 4 million slaves in the United States. The drawing here shows a woman and her child being auctioned off as property to white men. Slaves had no rights and worked under horrible conditions. With the Union's victory came freedom for the slaves, but African Americans were still viewed as lesser. They weren't granted citizenship until 1869 and couldn't vote until 1870. Although they were legally allowed to vote, there were measures such as literacy tests used to stop them because most African Americans couldn't read and write at the time. The Jim Crow laws enforced a separate but equal mentality that allowed for segregation, discrimination, and violence against African Americans. In the 1954 decision Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. There was a lot of backlash from white people over this decision. A year later, 14-year-old Emmett Till was murdered by a white couple. While events like this were not uncommon, the timing allowed this crime to gain attention on a national scale. In the same year, Claudette Colvin, who was 15 at the time, refused to give up her seat to a white person on the bus. 9 months later, Rosa Parks did the same. The regularity of these incidents encouraged the start of the Montgomery bus boycott, largely organized by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The boycott lasted just over a year until the segregation of buses was also ruled unconstitutional. In 1963, 250,000 protesters participated in the March on Washington, a nonviolent protest to demand equal rights. It was after this protest that Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his most famous speech, "I Have a Dream." The following year, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned segregation and racial discrimination on a national scale. A similar law in 1965 banned the use of literacy tests in the voting booths. This vastly improved voter turnout and led to more African Americans being elected in the government in the coming years. On April 4, 1968, while in Memphis, Tennessee to support a sanitation workers' strike, Martin Luther King Jr. was fatally shot on the balcony of his hotel. It was about a week later that the Civil Rights Act of 1968 was signed into law, banning racial discrimination in the housing industry and making racial violence a federal crime. Before his death, King organized the Poor People's Campaign as a demand to alleviate poverty. This was a multiracial effort with about 3,000 people of all races camping out for 6 weeks at the Washington Mall to raise awareness. This too is nonviolent. The Civil Rights Movement did bring an end to segregation, and technically all races are equal under the law, but prejudice still exists in America. Systemic racism is still a prominent issue, as can be seen by the death of George Floyd and so many others. Thank you for listening.